Good evening and welcome to our Waltham Public Library program, The Disappearance of Trudy Solomon, with author Marcy McCreary. My name is Deborah Hoffman and I organize programs and events for the library. Thanks for tuning in. Before we start, I want to let you know how the evening will go. Our speaker will introduce her book and then I'll be interviewing her, after which she'll field questions from you. To ask questions via the chat function, use a Google account to sign into YouTube. Feel free to write your questions at any time, and then I'll read them during the Q&A. Marcy McCreary is a Massachusetts resident who, growing up, spent her summers in the Catskills, where her father was activities director at two of the resorts. The inspiration for her novel was an article about a Concord Hotel waitress who mysteriously disappeared in the 1970s and was found 40 years later in an Alzheimer's facility in Lowell, Mass. Marcy has worked in marketing and communications at various Massachusetts-based publishing and media companies. She lived in Waltham for over a decade in the early 2000s. She now lives in Hull. We're so excited to be hosting her. Over to you, author Marcy McCreary.
Hey everyone, welcome to my home in Nantucket. So I actually live in both Hull and Nantucket, and during the spring and the fall, I'm here. So what I'd like to do is really briefly tell you a little bit about the inspiration for this novel, and also why I've set some scenes in Waltham and around the Boston area, and also read a little bit from the novel itself. So as Deborah said, my inspiration for this novel was an article that I read in the Boston Globe, and this is it, that a woman was found more than 4 decades later. A missing woman is found in Lowell. And it turns out that she went missing from the Concord Hotel in the Catskills, a place where I grew up. I've never heard this story. I was absolutely I was just so curious about what happened to this woman. I'm like, is anybody going to find out? I mean, 40 years and she can't tell them what happened to her. And it just really nagged at me. I had to say, like, for weeks and weeks, it just was like, what happened to this woman? And I finally decided, you know what? I'm going to fictionalize her story. I'm going to make it into a really cool mystery that spans 40 years from her time in the Catskills to current day. And the interesting thing about this story is that the reason that the case was opened was because detectives had found skeleton remains on the side of the road. They assumed it was this woman, Flora Stevens, who I call Trudy Solomon, and hence they opened the case. And curiously, one of the detectives decided to do a Social Security search on her Social Security number, and they saw it ping in this Lowell facility for Alzheimer's. And that's how they tracked her down. But there was no other information to sort of fill in those blanks. And so that's where I came in. I was like, well, I'll fill in the blanks because I really think that it would be fun to kind of just fictionalize someone's story, and especially because I have a really strong background with the Catskills and with Massachusetts. So that's how sort of the two areas came into being for the story. I include places like Waltham and Hull because they're places that I live. And I think what I try to do with this story is that it is a convergence of what is true and what is fictionalized. So there are many aspects of this story, maybe personal experiences I've had, maybe not specifically people I know, but my own personal experiences are in this book, as well as the fact that a lot of this stuff is just made up. So it's a really nice convergence of those two things based on the fact that this is based on a true story, but I've actually fictionalized it. So what I'd like to do before I take questions from you, Deborah, is read the very beginning of the book. It's actually sort of the setup where Detective Susan Ford is notified that there's a possibility that Trudy Solomon has been found. And it's a case that has dogged her father for 40 years. He was the lead detective on the case back in 1978 and was unable to solve it. So when he gets wind of the fact that this case might be reopened, he wants in on it. So this is the part of the story where she has just found out that Trudy Solomon is alive and well, and so she goes to visit her father to give him the news, and you'll see his reaction. A new sign greeted me at the entrance at Dad's Digs. Welcome to Horizon Meadows Residences. What I wanted to know is who came up with the name Horizon Meadows? Did they just pick two random words and throw them together? The place was literally in the woods. You could barely imagine a horizon, and anything that might once have been a meadow has been subdivided and built on. So why not call it Forest Haven or Sylvan Acres? Maybe because for the residents of a place like this, the horizon was a metaphor for what awaits them all. After a second heart attack, Dad relented, but not without complaint. Claimed he would die within 6 months of moving, as he put it, to an old age home. He was convinced he would be reduced to a drooling, blithering, incapable clod. That was 2 years ago. Then a few old guys from the police force moved in. At 77, Dad was the reigning Horizon Meadows Bridge and Shuffleboard champion. Him and most of his buddies were in level 1, independent living, a decently appointed one-bedroom apartment with an emergency call button in the bathroom. Bud was in level 3, a floor in the building that featured a nurse on duty at all times. And poor Andy, level 4. Dementia got the best of him, but he joined them in the dining hall on his better days. A few months ago, he asked my father to put a pillow over his head when he reached level 6. I doubt Dad would oblige, but then again, I wouldn't bet on it. As I made my way through the lobby to the computer room, I wondered if Dad had gotten wind of the Trudy Solomon story. If he had, I was pretty sure I would have heard from him. I spouted Dad on the far side of the computer room, helping Agnes navigate her granddaughter's Facebook page. Hey, Dad. Hi, Agnes. Agnes leaned toward Dad like a lion protecting her cub. Hi, Susan, Agnes purred. Will told me about your brush with death. I prayed for you every night. And well, here you are, looking wonderful. Prayers answered. God is looking out for you. He must have heard you. I glanced at Dad, eyebrows raised, admonishing my sarcasm. Thank you, Agnes. I'll take all the help I can get. Well, 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 the prodigal daughter has returned. How's the bullet wound? Dad, I'm fine. I've got some news for you. I glanced sideways at Agnes. Can we find a quiet place to talk? Agnes patted Dad's arm. We could do this later. I'll be right here when you return. It was unseasonably warm for late October, the temperature hovering around 70 degrees, so we headed out to the benches behind the main building. There's been a break in the Trudy Solomon case. I paused to study his reaction. Skepticism. She's alive. Ray's found her. His mouth twitched and one eyebrow lifted ever so slightly, signaling a shift from incredulous to unconvinced. Are you sure it's her? 100% sure. What happened to her? Where's she been all these years? That's still not clear. She has Alzheimer's, has had it for a while now. Then how do you know it's her? I told him how they found skeletal remains that jogged the case open, then traced the social security number to Gertrude Resnick. I told him that she'd identified herself from a Cuttman Hotel work ID photo proclaiming me, and then verbally identifying her husband, Ben Solomon, when shown a picture of him. Holy shit. He paused and shook his head. Where is she? In an Alzheimer's care facility in Lowell, Massachusetts. I'll be damned. A social security number trace? Sounds so simple. Dad, things were different back then. You couldn't just plug a social security number into a computer. Don't second guess yourself. Dad shifted his attention to his shoes and poked at the dirt with the tip of his worn loafers. And the remains that were found, has she been identified? Nope. So now what? Is Ray going to find out what happened to Trudy? I mean, maybe she was kidnapped. There could still be a criminal element to this. I think you know the answer to that. Eldridge is not going to put any more resources on this. Did he say that? Well, no, but where's the crime? She's been found. Don't you want to know what happened to her? Sure, I'm curious, but ask Eldridge to reopen the case or take a leave of absence. Help me figure this out. We had the beginning. We now have the ending. Let's figure out the middle. Are you kidding? For what reason? Do I sound like I'm kidding? This has haunted me for decades. I deserve to know what happened. We finally have a break we can work with. So that's the opening. That's towards the beginning of the book, after it's been established that Trudy is alive, and Susan goes to her dad and reveals that there's a possibility that she might be looking into the case. And of course, and of course, they get the go ahead to figure out what happened to Trudy Solomon. And I don't know if we have time, if I should read another passage, the one that has to do in Waltham, or if you just want to hold off on that. Any nods, any?
I would say, why don't I start asking you questions? And
fine,
we'll,
perfect.
Okay. Okay. First, I want to say that I loved this book and I read it in 3 days. So it's just very gripping. But I'd like you to start by telling us about your main character, Susan Ford. She's complicated.
She's complicated because, it's not like she had a traumatic childhood, but she had a rough childhood because her mother was an alcoholic and her father was a workaholic. So, she just, those typical issues gives her issues of self-esteem. I mean, she herself, she doubts herself. She's very contemplative, but she also has a habit of second guessing herself. And that's not helpful when you are a detective and, trying to move along in a case. So she's got to overcome, some of the baggage that she carries around with her from when she was a teenager, and she kind of feels like her life is falling apart. On top of that, she suffers from a condition called Palmer hyperhidrosis. I don't know if anybody knows anybody who has this. My daughter has this, so she really helped me understand what life is like to have perpetually sweaty hands and feet. You are so nervous about shaking people's hands, you are constantly wiping your hands, you're putting secret deodorant on them. And your hands are always clammy and wet. And so it's just the physical condition that she has that sort of makes her very self-conscious and very self-aware. And so that her self-esteem issues don't only manifest itself psychologically, mentally, but also physically in this particular Palmer hyperhidrosis condition.
Yeah, I had never heard about that.
Yeah, I probably would have never heard about it either, except that my daughter really does have it.
Yeah.
There's a lot of drummers who actually just sweat because they play the drums a lot. There's a surgery that you could do that actually sort of cuts the sweat glands in a certain place to prevent your hands from sweating. And she has actually considered doing this. And I was like, wow, I don't think so.
Yeah.
Will is an interesting character because he's a good, straightforward detective. He's, you certainly understand from his history that he's closed cases. He's a workaholic, and he sort of was very focused in police work that he sort of did leave the family to kind of be on their own. So, he carries that baggage with him. But he's hell bent on figuring out what happened to Trudy Solomon because it's the one case that made him feel like a failure.
Right. So this is his second chance.
This is right. And his last chance.
Right. Do you want to talk at all about Susan's, how she's just returned to work when this all happens and why?
Yeah. So this was, it's funny because I wrote this book prior to 2020. So, even though we certainly have a lot of history and references to racial protesting, whatever. But before 2020, of course, the eruption in 2020, I found it all really interesting that my book was pretty much tied into sort of what was going on. I thought it was important in doing a police procedural that there has to be some, at the very least, mention or understanding of the culture in a police department around Black Lives Matter, around Blue Lives Matter, around what happens when a white officer shoots a Black man or woman. And to present it in a way that I tried to do it in a way that sort of showed both sides of the equation. And I hope I did. I think there's a little bit of social commentary that comes through for sure, because I lean liberal. So but so does Susan. So it's her character that offers up that point of view, but you certainly see other point of views, especially with her boyfriend and others, as to what transpired. When the book opens, she is on desk duty. She has shot a Black teenager in a drug bust that she swears has had a gun. And that's a subplot in the story as to how that unfolds, how that affects her in the community. She is actually very involved in police reform and the BLM movement within her community. So that puts her in a very awkward position. And you know that she's someone who's very attuned to it. And then you've got the town itself that is conflicted because they know her as a police officer, yet here it has happened in their own backyard. So it is, I kind of feel it's a controversial aspect of my book, but I had something to say. So I kind of feel like it's important that if authors are going to write police procedurals in current day, to ignore it seems unrealistic. And so it's a subplot. It's not a huge part of the story, but it affects Susan. It's part of her character arc and coming to terms with what she did. And, facing up to the possibility that she shares, an unconscious bias, or that it exists. It exists whether you know it or not, and that's part of that story. So I thought it was important as part of her character arc to have a story that's very, very contemporary and very realistic for today.
Yeah, it definitely works. So in the story, you mention a podcast called My Favorite Murder, and it's one that Susan likes to listen to. And I was wondering, do you follow that podcast? And are mystery novels and podcasts your go-to?
My go-to for mystery is books and Netflix. Because I am a big watcher of police procedurals, especially foreign police procedurals, and I read a lot of mystery, a lot. Like that's my go-to genre. It was when I was young. I tend to read mystery, women's fiction, literary fiction. Those seem to be sort of the books that I gravitate to, but a lot of mystery. I grew up on Dick Francis and Agatha Christie and P.D. James. These days I read a lot of British authors like Kate Atkinson and Susie Steiner, Tana French and Denise Mina. If you don't know any of those authors and you're into mystery, I highly recommend them. They are the top of the game, Val McDermott and Netflix. I don't listen to a lot of podcasts. I'm not as into true crime as I am into fictional crime, although I do read true crime stories, and I do like true crime documentaries on Netflix. My daughter, the one who has Palmer hyperhidrosis, is a huge fan of My Favorite Murder. Like, I think both my daughters actually have listened to every single episode.
Wow. And
my husband is also an author. His name is Lou McCreary, and he wrote a book called The Minus Man. And and the episode that I mentioned in the book is actually the episode where they bring up his novel that was made into a movie called The Minus Man. So there's a little, meta stuff going on in my book. But yeah, so I love My Favorite Murder. It's two women chatting about true crime. They usually cover like 2 or 3 different cases that are connected in some way, usually thematically. And I love that Susan listens to this. She doesn't listen to the news. She doesn't listen to cable news. She doesn't want to hear politics. She doesn't want to hear music. She listens to podcasts and true crime podcasts. And she tries to get everybody around her to listen to them as well. But yeah, I'm a big fan of mystery. So yeah.
Cool. Well, she gets her dad turned on to it too. So
she gets a dad, she tries to get a boyfriend, but he's like, he's a Game of Thrones kind of guy. So
right. Your plot is very complex, which makes it interesting. But how do you keep track of all the details while you're writing?
Okay, so I have a lot of people ask me if I'm a plotter or if I'm a pantser. So most authors fall into 1 or 2 categories. A plotter is someone who plots out everything from the prologue to the epilogue, every detail is plotted out. That's not me. I'm a pantser to a point. So I start my story and I let the characters lead me along. With a police procedural, I think it's somewhat easy because there's always a logical next step. What did Susan find out? And what would be the next step? Just think of any detective series. You get a piece of information and that takes you to another lead, There does come a point though, where you're leaving clues and you're leaving red herrings. And I say somewhere around 60%, when I'm about 60% into the book, I have to step away and I do have to outline. I have to figure out how I'm going to create a really propulsive end to the story and, wrapping it up. So that part I do have to somewhat outline, and I'm doing it now. I'm actually at the 60% part of the next book in the series. And I'm more sort of thinking about, well, this needs to happen and this needs to happen. I'm coming to the finish line. So at that point, I need to look back and make sure that red herrings and clues and characters, because I have a lot of them, are straight. There are many times when I start the book calling somebody by one name, and by the middle of the book, I'm calling them a different name. I have to go back and go, wait, what was that guy's name? So I mean, for a book like this, where you have a lot of characters, and you have essentially 3 plots. You've got the Trudy Solomon plot. You've also got the plot of the woman that was found on the side of the road, the skeleton that was found on the side of the road. I mean, that becomes a mystery unto itself too. And then you have the shooting of the Black teenager. So you've got these 3 things that are happening, and and they need to converge. They need to become one story. They need to, for the reader to be satisfied, the stories have to sort of come together. They can't end up on their own path. That would be very confusing. So I personally find it fun to just sort of let it go in the beginning and let the characters bring me along chapter to chapter. But there is this point where, yes, I do have to get more detailed oriented and kind of figure things out and make sure they make sense.
Right. Okay, that makes sense. Can you tell us a little bit more about the backstory, sort of the inspiration for your story? You showed that article that you saw in the Globe.
Yeah, so I was actually writing a different story. I was about maybe a quarter of the way into a novel that I was writing, and I liked what I was doing. I probably could have gone on with it, but I read this article like in the Boston Globe, and it just nagged at me. I was like constantly every week I would turn to my husband and go, whatever happened to her? Why wouldn't anybody figure out what happened to her? And I think that if you think about how creativity works, if you think about sort of inspiration, it's those things, those ideas that just keep coming back at you and nagging at you, that it's like it's a gift from God. It must have landed in my lap for some reason that I just could not let it go. And I think it's because of my upbringing in the Catskills. That was that aspect of it. And And the fact that it ended up in Lowell, Massachusetts, and the fact that the woman had Alzheimer's and early onset Alzheimer's, she wasn't, that she couldn't tell anybody what happened to her and nobody knew what happened to her. It was just really just got into my brain like a tick. And so I put aside the other story and I said, okay, well, who's the protagonist in this story? Is it Trudy Solomon? Is it the original detective on the case? Is it the detectives who found her? And I thought, it would be really cool if the original detective on the case, his daughter, was in the police force and they got together and sort of like Veronica Mars meets Barnaby Jones. And, I have a father-daughter detective team where they have totally different motivations for solving this crime. He is, it was a case he couldn't solve. And for her, she's actually coming more from my point of view of, we should give this woman a life. I mean, we should tell her story because nobody can. And so she comes to it in a more human sort of curiosity, the way that I had. And her father comes to it like this, crazy, dogged, determined, we need to find this out now.
Right. He just wants to solve the case.
He just wants to solve it. And she's like super contemplative, she's like always thinking things through. And, she procrastinates too. Like, and I kind of give hints in little ways, like she didn't fix the steps to her house. There's a crack in her window. And she always thinks, oh, I meant to do that. I meant to do that. She's, she takes it slow. She, sorts things out, and he's like, let's go. And at one point she's like, am I Batman or Robin? Am I Sherlock Holmes or Watson? Like she's trying to get in her head, who's the lead here? Is he solving the case and I'm along for the ride? Or am I solving this case and he's along for the ride? So it's they go back and forth as to sort of who takes the lead in the case.
Yeah. So the novel relates the changes that afflicted a rather distinct geographical area. Do you think that the demise of the Catskill Hotels affected the characters and story? And if so, how?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think one of the stories I wanted to tell in this novel is actually the arc of the area. I mean, that in itself is its own story. And to have the characters rise and fall with it, I think it was just interesting. And that was the other thing that drew me to the story, is that 1978 was, I wouldn't call it the heyday, and there were glimmers of that things were starting to move in the wrong direction. But the Catskills was still very, very active at that time, very active. I mean, it wasn't Dirty Dancing like by then, but it was still, the hotels were active and busy, but you could begin to see the cracks forming. And so it's interesting to see these owners of the hotel and sort of where their standing was in these towns, which was, they were like royalty, really. I mean, at least that was my perception of them. I remember thinking they were really wealthy. They probably really weren't, but, they had homes on the properties and these huge, and they just tons of guests coming in. And there was a sense that because of these hotels, the towns did really well. The towns were vibrant: Monticello, South Fallsburg, Liberty. These places were Woodburn. I mean, all these places were doing fairly well because even though the guests would go to these all-inclusive places, there was enough economic, motion that it just really kind of helped everybody. So as the area started to decline and less of a Jewish clientele was coming up there, and the owners started abandoning the area started, looking like, like it was just crumbling. I mean, so Hasidic groups came in, snapped up bungalows cheaply. Hotel owners at the very end were having very hard time selling. So most of those were just abandoned hotels. And you're beginning to see it swing now in the other direction, where there's this sort of mix of, there's a little bit of gambling coming into the area, and the gambling referendums were passed so that that hotels could then take advantage of that. But you're also seeing a different sort of, group come up there. There's a lot of arts and cultural, and the Catskills region itself is trying to sort of rebrand itself as, a place to get away and enjoy upstate New York. It's not that far from the city. So I think the characters sort of move with that. Their lives move with that. Susan and Will are the townies that sort of live through the demise of the Catskills from living in the area. And then you've got the owners who, get out on a high note, and then the hotel regions just collapse.
Yeah. Interesting parallels. So your main characters are a father-daughter team. Are they real life role models?
No. So, but my father, who's not a detective, was a tumler, an activities director at both the Brickman Hotel and the Cutcher's Hotel. I grew up solely at the Brickman Hotel. I was there from the age of 2 to the age of 20. And so, he's a very gregarious guy, well loved by everybody. He and I are close, but not in the way that, and my father's a workaholic. I have to say, he always had 4 or 5 jobs. When he wasn't being an activities director, he was in a band, he sang, he played bass guitar, he's a teacher, he's a principal. He was always working, and he's 80 years old and he still works. My parents both work. They're 80 years old. So, but they weren't absent, I didn't have this absentee parents. So Will and Susan are not me and my dad. They're completely fictional characters. And their relationship is completely fictional too. If I borrow any personality traits, I think it's just it's in you. It's maybe there's some aspects of Will's gregariousness, and he's a schmoozer and he's really social, and you could see that in his interactions with, he's the most popular person at Horizon Meadows. My father's the most popular person wherever he goes. So he's just this schmoozy, great character, where Susan is not like that at all. Get me out of here. She says I'm more like my mother. And my mother is not an alcoholic. She always wants me to make sure everybody knows that. My mother is not an alcoholic. Vera is Susan's mother is one of my favorite characters in the novel. And I loved her so much that she plays a much bigger role in the second in the series that I'm writing now. A redemption story, I like to say.
Yeah, cool. Can you talk a little bit about the research that you had to do for this book?
So when it comes to research, I felt like I was familiar enough with the areas that I didn't really have to sort of delve into what happened to the Catskills. I lived and breathed it. I knew what happened at the Catskills. So I can feel very personal about how I write that. As opposed, the things I do research is police procedural, or how somebody can be stabbed with a knife, or it's funny, if the FBI ever came and got my computer, all I would find things is money laundering, how to kill somebody with a knife, how to strangle somebody in the middle of the night. So my research is mainly around trying to keep it. I want to keep it real. So crime scene, crime scene DNA, all of those things. I will really dive into how to get that right. But for the area and again, I'm treading realistic with fictional when it comes to places. And for Waltham, the only sort of place I mention is the police station, and the only thing I think is true about it is that's 2-story building, in Lexington. So that's it. But other than that, the characters are made up. When they go to Hull, which is where I live now, I've actually built a lot of realism into that. I mean, I know the area again very well. So as she travels through the town, I make mention of different things within that town. So that's kind of fun, because people do like to read books in towns that they know of, and oh, I know that restaurant.
Yeah.
Oh my God, they went there. not really.
Well, Hull in particular, you describe the whole sort of downtown area. Very
Yeah, I
well.
mean, it's a peninsula that's like just 8 miles long, 9 miles long. So yeah, so it's really easy to go from one end to the other and describe the entire peninsula like in a paragraph. But yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It makes it much more real when you do that.
Yeah, I mean, they get there. I bring in sort of like the hotel that they're staying at. That's a real place, and and then sort of they make their way to Pemberton Point. It's a real place, and what they do, and they're there, and sort of the person they meet, their house is like this over the top, using a sea motif, which you see, you walk even here in Nantucket, you walk into somebody's house and you're like, it's a sea motif, over the seashells and captain wheels and all the stuff that makes it feel like you live by the sea.
Right. Lobster crates.
Lobster crates, right. Lamp shades that look like lighthouses, which I actually do own here in.
Do you have a favorite scene?
I have a lot of different favorite scenes. I think all of the scenes with Susan and her dad are probably some of my favorite scenes. I think they're sort of where they're halfway between camaraderie and father-daughter. I mean, I really enjoyed writing those scenes because each of their personalities get to come out through the dialogue. He's funny, and she tries to match his, humor. And so I would have to say nearly every scene that involves the two of them. I also like writing the interrogation scenes, like when they get somebody in an interrogation room and they got to get the guy to, give up some information. That's a lot of fun to write too. And again, this is where I did some research sort of on how police goad people into, confessing. And it's not just in one meeting. It generally happens over time. And one of the interesting things I found out, because I actually did a seminar with British police who's doing a seminar on police procedures. In the UK, you cannot trick a suspect. You can't lie to them. You can't tell them you have something you don't have. You can't trick. In the US, you can trick. You can lie. You could say we know something, or somebody's going to turn on. You can say whatever you want. I thought that was really interesting.
Wow.
Yeah.
I did not know that.
Yeah.
Do you have a central message that you want or that you hope readers will take away from your novel?
I do. There's a lot of themes in this novel, but I think like the one thing that I'd love readers to walk away with is this feeling of empathy, that for those who can embrace empathy, understand, to walk in someone's shoes for a day, to really understand what makes somebody tick, you are going to be successful. You're going to figure things out. You're going to lead a better life for it and have successes because you have opened yourself up to other people's feelings and the way other people's motivations. And if you don't have empathy in this story, you lose. I mean, I don't want to give anything away, but it's clear that those who cannot walk a day in somebody else's shoes do not fare well in my book. So I think that if you really kind of think of some overarching as you're reading this book, the characters that really embrace empathy to understand for me, a police detective who can really understand what motivates somebody to do what they do, whether it's good or bad, is going to be a good police officer, a good detective. And of course, the villains are the folks that don't have a shred of empathy. And so they get their comeuppance. I mean, that's, it's like the whole thing is like karma, if you're going to do these things, and every mystery novel is like this, thriller novels, you have good versus evil, and to satisfy the reader at the end, good has to win out. And that can happen in many forms, even if it doesn't feel like they got the killer or whoever it is at the end. At least things have been resolved. At least to me, the more important story is that of the protagonist, of that of Susan and Will and their story arc. Have they made it through whatever it is that was holding them back to end up to be better people, to have better relationships, to have better outcomes? Because at the end of the day, any novel is about the protagonist, not, or like maybe character-driven novels, as opposed to sort of what finally happened with the plot.
And you do see that growth throughout the novel, in particular with Susan.
Okay.
We do have one question from an audience member, so I think I'll read that now. How closely are the characters based on real people you know? And how did your Catskills experience work into the book?
So as I explained earlier, I'll start with the Catskill experience. I mean, those are my coming of age experiences. I was a little girl in the day camp there. Week after week, new guests would come in. My father was the activities director. If you ever saw Dirty Dancing or The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel and those Concord Hotel scenes, that was pretty much my summers. But I also got to see what was going on around me within those towns. You would come off the grounds and you would go into the different towns and you go to bars at night and clubs when I got older. I'd actually sneak off when I was like 15, 16, 17 years old with my twin sister. And we would go to bars and clubs with the bellhops and the waiters. And we hung out with the staff. We hung out with the guests. I mean, we really sort of we just enjoyed ourselves. We just had, looking back on it, it's amazing that I didn't realize in the moment how great it was. I met my first husband at the Chalet, which was the Pines Bar at night. And, so I have a lot of experiences there. And so to that question's point, it's like, I just lived it. I lived it and I loved it and felt I can set. And this novel really isn't set at a hotel in that time period. I think I do want to do that at some point, but it certainly helped inform me in reading this book. The characters are not based on anybody. They're not even composites of anybody. They are born out of what's necessary for the story. So although some of their experiences are real life experiences that I've had, there's this incident where there's a drunk driver that kills Ray's parents, and the woman who was in the car, the only survivor, comes to see Ray about a year or so later to apologize on behalf of her boyfriend who got killed, because she feels like she should have not even let him in the car. She too was, she had the power to stop him from. When I was living in Waltham, so here's a Waltham story. Woman comes flying up Plimpton Street, crashes into our fence in our tree in front of our house. She is just completely drunk. She's a college student, and nobody was hurt. We found out she wasn't hurt. Luckily she missed our house. She slammed into the tree in the fence. Think that can be repaired. A year later, she shows up on our doorstep to apologize. And she said it just took her a year to get up the nerve and the therapy, whatever, to come see us. And we welcomed her in and we hugged and cried and whatever. And so that experience is real. That was a real story. And I would say to my kids all the time, I'd rather be mad than sad. So if you want to call me at 2:00 in the morning to pick you up, even if it's a friend, I will pick you up. I won't say a word, drop everybody off, end of it. And so that whole thing about Ray and his involvement in this drunk driving program in the high school is actually a real experience. So a lot of these experiences are real. No one's going to know what's real or not, because I don't think I make it very clear. But the characters are not real. There's not even the owners of the hotel. They're not people that I know, or to me, I mean, those hotel owners are pretty villainous. So, I mean, I just don't know anybody like that. That's the fun of fiction. I could have even made them even more over the top, but decided not to. But yeah, so I mean, I think that's the beauty of fiction. It is fiction.
Yes, yes. So here's another question for you. What is the next project that you're working on?
So I'm working on the sequel to this book. It has a working title it's called The Murder of Madison Garcia. It takes place in Monticello, New York, in present day, and present day being 2019, because to write a contemporary novel in 2020, and you want to make it real, you'd have to bring COVID into the equation, right? So I'm beginning to see that now with novels, but I wanted to pick up where I left off. So it worked out really well. This book ended in June of 2019, and the next book picks up in June of 2019. And so it's a more of a straightforward murder mystery. It's less complex. I want to do something a little bit more straightforward. I wanted to bring most of the characters back. So a lot of not the cameo characters, although the bird lady is back, Eleanor Campbell, the one with the budgies. But for the most part, all the main characters are back. I really love them. I wanted them to be involved in a different way. Only in this next story, Susan is lead detective, and her father is not supposed to be involved in the case, and yet he worms his way in at every possible chance he gets. And so it becomes more of again, this sort of comedic playing off of each other. They should not be, he shouldn't be anywhere near this case, and she shouldn't be consulting with her dad, and yet these things are happening. But it's a murder mystery that takes place in Monticello, and most of it, unlike this book where they're kind of going off to different directions and states, the bulk of it takes place in upstate New York and New York City and Brooklyn.
Well, I love that you're going to have another story involving Susan and her dad, because I think at the end of a book, the reader always feels sad that that relationship with those characters is now over. So
I actually wasn't planning on writing a sequel, and so I didn't even start writing it until people were saying you should really write a sequel. And I'm like, and even like the Publishers Weekly review came out and said, I hope this is a series. And I'm like, oh my God, okay, well, if Publishers Weekly wants it to be a series, then I better make it a series. So yeah, I had a story to tell. So I had I came up with an idea pretty quickly, again, based on an actual experience, and said, oh, you know what? I think I have a story here. So got to it. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit just about your writing process, like what a typical day would look like for you? And
yeah, so the way I wrote Trudy Solomon is actually very different from I'm writing now, but I just typically you do have to be super disciplined. Like you do have to set goals, or especially like people say, oh, well, COVID, it must've been so easy. You were home, there's nothing to do. I was so distracted for all the crazy reasons that I think everybody else was, which was, I was worried about everybody else. And talking about empathy, I was worried about my kids and how they're in their 20s, the best time of your life, and they're not living their life. So I was concerned about them. The book was sold by that point. And so I was dealing with rewrites and editing and public, and marketing and all this stuff. So that was, that was in my head. So 2020 was really difficult. And the election, I mean, come on. I mean, everybody's doom scrolling on Twitter, and I'm like, everything is always something else. And, then there's a riot on Capitol Hill. I'm like, it was really hard to be focused. But the process, when I do stick to it, I write first thing in the morning, and I set goals. And like we were mentioning earlier, Deborah, it's generally word goals. Like I'm going to write 500 words a day. I'm going to write 1,000 words a day. And so you just have to, so I sit down and I'll write anywhere from 500 to 1,000 words. And then what I do is I go back to the last thing that I wrote, the last 1,000 words, and I read through that and polish it a little bit, and then read through what I just wrote. And then I put it aside. And that's it. And then I come back the next day, the next morning, and I do it again. And so it's fresh writing, going back to the day before this. And then there comes this point where I need to go all the way back to the beginning and read through it again, make sure I have all the names straight, and sort of kind of just make sure that it's following a logical path, again, because it's a police procedural. So that's my process. And again, I'm a pantser in the beginning. So I don't have an outline. I know what's going to happen. See, I do have the whole story in my head. I know what's going to happen at the end. I know what the outcome is. It's getting there. I'm just what is Susan going to do next? What is Susan going to do next? So, and then I get to this point where I do outline probably the last 100 pages of the book to make sure it all begins to tie together. It's tight, it's paced well, it's propulsive. That needs to be outlined.
So about how many hours are you sitting in front of your computer?
Oh, writing 500 words can take anywhere from 45 minutes to 2 hours. Because people are thinking 500 words, that's not a lot. Like, it's just like a couple of paragraphs. But, when you're trying to sort of write when I was writing this, I think I did it much faster. I think I really had the scenes in my head a little bit more. I don't know why. Maybe because I was so excited by this idea when I first started that I was writing 2,000 words in a day. And that would take me a few hours, like almost probably from 8 a.m. till 3 o'clock in the afternoon. But now I'm at a sort of this more sort of slower pace of doing about 500 to 750 words a day. And it takes me all morning. Yeah. Like, I start at 8 o'clock in the morning and I'm generally done by 1. And if I have it in me to keep writing, I do. But I do projects for my daughter, who's a musician. I do a lot of her social and marketing. And her debut EP came out 4 days before the book came out. So at the same time I'm marketing this book, I'm doing all of her. So my background's in marketing. So we work together. Her name is Betty Reed. So I've been doing a lot of that too. So what I do is I try to compartmentalize. I do the writing in the morning and I do her stuff in the afternoon. But for some reason, her stuff creeps into my stuff.
Sort of the nature of working from home, I would guess.
The nature of working with your daughter as a client.
Right. Well, I think those are all the questions that I have for you, and it doesn't look like we have any more from the audience. Okay. So I want to thank you for being with us tonight.
It was great. Thank you.
Your book was a delight, and I want to thank everyone for tuning in, and hope you can come back. And I look forward to reading your next story.
Thank you, Deborah. I really appreciate it. Thank you, everyone, for coming.